If you're a PPC Google Ads manager, you've seen that scary notification inside your campaign account where it says limited by budget. Here, I'm just going to break down what it actually is. Sometimes we get freaked out and we shouldn't overreact. It's super important to not react quickly to even a limited by budget notification or anything. How's it going, everybody? My name is Gene Villanos from the PPC Cave. Today is a solo episode. Ryan will be joining us next time, but you have me just for this episode. And today we're on episode 59, talking about the truth about limited by budget. So if you're a PPC Google Ads manager, you've seen that scary notification inside your campaign account where it says limited by budget. Here, I'm just going to break down what it actually is. Sometimes we get freaked out and we shouldn't overreact. I think if you're trying to become a really smart and savvy Google Ads PPC manager, it's super important to not react quickly to even a limited by budget notification or anything in your Google Ads account. You shouldn't let anything faze you, and you should take things with a grain of salt and complete the analysis before you do any type of changes or just freak out. So, limited by budget. My first point is, when can this trigger and why can this trigger? Well, the reason why limited by budget can trigger, first and foremost, I want to explain, especially to the more junior PPC Google Ads managers, or if you don't have that much experience, this triggers because of potential growth, not actual spend efficiency. Again, I'm going to say that one more time. The limited by budget red notification on your Google Ads account triggers because it's based on potential growth. And if you're on YouTube or Spotify video, I'm using air quotes because potential growth is what Google Ads sees, but does not necessarily mean or equate to actual conversions or leads or signups. That's just what Google sees. So they usually measure potential growth by impressions or clicks. And we all know that more impressions or more clicks does not always equate conversions. I think that's super important to understand. Google's definition, just like many other things inside a Google Ads account, such as auto apply recommendations being top of mind, even with limited by budget, that doesn't necessarily mean what it reads, limited by budget. That doesn't necessarily mean you're not spending efficiently. And I'll go on in this episode to kind of give you a little bit of a toolbox so you can understand how to react to these notifications inside your Google Ads account, or maybe how to not overreact to these notifications. I think it's super important also to understand that Google can also trigger this limited by budget notification if you maybe switch from phrase or exact search keywords in a search campaign to maybe broad. Sometimes a campaign can switch on immediately to limited by budget, just doing those small things, being a little bit more broad with your search keywords as opposed to tighter with phrases and exact. So yeah, don't freak out. That doesn't necessarily mean, I can tell you right now, that you're spending inefficiently. And there are ways to make sure or vet, is my account really limited by budget, or is this just another ploy for Google Ads to say, hey, the more you spend with us, the more impressions you're going to get, the more clicks you're going to get. So that means you're going to get more conversions, right? Which is not the case if you've had any experience in Google Ads. If you have any secondary bid adjustments, this could also trigger limited by budget. Sometimes I have search campaigns that are lead gen that need to target a geolocation, such as, a 50-mile, 100-mile radius or a couple cities or counties. This by nature can, trigger a limited by budget. You're not necessarily limited by budget. If you have any device locations, or even if you're day parting on an ad schedule, maybe you have a specific increase, budget increase, or bid increase, increase bid adjustment on the weekend. Say you're really bidding aggressively Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Then Google can say, hey, if you're bidding aggressively on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, you won't be missing out on more impressions or more clicks. So that's a slippery slope of actually defining what limited by budget is so that you don't freak out and you don't just do whatever Google Ads or Google pushes onto your screen, auto apply recommendation this, increase limited by budget that. And if you've ever noticed when you click the actual red button, it's huge increases of budget, not just minuscule where it should be like 5 to 20% increase in bid in your bid adjustment, your budget, not bid adjustment, but your budget. They're going to suggest if you click that little red limited by budget notification, huge increases. I've seen 40, almost 50% budget increase so that little thing will go away, So understand how to break down and vet and confirm if your account needs more budget before just clicking that and freaking out. So I think that's super important first to define when can this be triggered and why, before we actually get into, when to ignore it, when to increase it. But the second point or question is, when do I actually ignore this limited by budget? I think the biggest first step is find the reasoning why the budget is limited. Don't take Google Ads word for it, as I mentioned, right? One thing that I do is check search lost by impression share or search impression share lost by budget or due to budget. I think if it's under 10%, I usually just ignore that. And that comes up a lot. There might be a campaign as a whole that says limited by budget. And then I go through and look and see if there's any impression share lost due to budget. And it says like 3%. So that's saying only 3% of your budget is lost, or only 3% of your search impression share is lost due to budget. That's not a significant amount to freak out and increase your budget on. So that's one thing that you have to check to make sure that, okay, I'm going to ignore this and not even increase the budget and just let it ride. Another thing is look at the return on ad spend, or look at the cost per conversion, or even your target cost per acquisition, your target CPA, and look at that from an extended angle. If you are seeing a limited by budget on January 1st, I would at least wait 2 weeks to see if the return on ad spend, the cost per conversion, or the target CPA, whatever your metrics are measuring the actual performance of a Google Ads account, if that's consistent, even 2 weeks of seeing the limited by budget, you could, for me, I would ignore that and see if that could be prolonged or if there's consistency there. A lot of the times it could say, limited by budget, and then you see a drop. You don't touch anything, then you might see a drop in performance. A drop in performance is not the best time to actually increase or scale your Google Ads account or your budget. In my opinion, it's consistent, long, weeks and months of the same return on ad spend, target CPA, cost per conversion, and you're seeing actually capped at that point where, the next step would be like, what would I do, or how would it look if I was to increase the budget? Would it look the same or would it be better? So understand that you need to observe. You need to observe the metrics. You can't just click, the limited by budget and increase the budget immediately. You have to observe. So that's when I would ignore it too, if there's not enough time that's gone by, to actually check and see if the performance is consistent. If you're still hitting the return on ad spend or your metrics, like I said, target CPA or cost per conversion, I would temporarily ignore that. Or, sometimes impressions or clicks in an ad group or campaign will drop off, but the account in general or the campaign in general is still hitting the metrics, the performance that you want or what the client wants. then I wouldn't be too hasty to go through and click increase in budget. So you have to make sure that enough time has gone by. You're keeping track of when that notification starts to show up, plus your performance. But month after month, if it's continuing to hold and stay consistent, then the next step naturally would be testing a larger budget or a budget increase. And, a little bit of more detail to that. Understand that if you were to do this, you have to pace this out, where the budget increases for me usually is between 5 to 10%, sometimes 15% if the client is really adamant on scale. you know but if you're doing a large 20, 30, 40, 50% jump in budget increase just because it says limited by budget, you're opening your channels and opening up your advertising to a lot of irrelevancy, which I understand. That's how you scale marketing and advertising. You have to bring your ads forward to those who haven't seen it, and they're going to be a little bit more irrelevant. But at that pace, you could really tank the performance of your account by doing such a large increase. So that's why it's super important to understand when to ignore it first. And then you could work backwards and say, okay, well, I've done this checklist that Gene told me to do. It's prolonged. I'm actually seeing it get capped. Maybe the next step is to increase that budget. But yeah, when to increase it is the final step. That's what all good PPC managers want to do, is continue to increase budgets so that we can, have consistent performance and still get more out of the Google Ads account by increasing the budget, because we're serving the ads to, people that are still relevant to our offering. And I think the first step is, if you're looking to increase it, understand, what I just mentioned, have we seen prolonged performance at this level that we want to see? AKA, is the client happy, or am I happy if I'm in-house? And that is up to you, because a lot of Google Ads accounts are different. Some are going to be e-commerce, who are really heavy focused on sales, and the return on ad spend may vary. Again, you might have lead generation, may be different with your, how you look at primary conversions. It could be a form fill, it could be a call, whatever it may be. But you have to see that performance is capped. And you don't see that immediately. You don't see that in one day. You don't see that in 2 days or 2 weeks, 3 weeks. You see that in many, many months. And I've had limited by budget on the best accounts that I handle and manage up to 3 months. I won't touch it. Limited by budget, I'm saying, okay, is it really limited? Am I seeing the ROAS that I want to see? And after 3 months, I think that's a really good amount of time for you to start increasing 5 to 10, maybe even at that point, 15% budget, and increase it. And if you're still hitting your goals, that means that you're in a position where you're going to scale the account, but you've done your due diligence as a PPC manager to understand, hey, this isn't a quick thing. I've seen 3 months of consistent data to create an action off of analysis, and not just because there's a scary red button that Google Ads or Google tells me to click. And another way to tell when to increase, beyond the time of consistency, is if there's a pacing issue. If there's a pacing issue, that's one thing that maybe I would do a increase a little bit earlier. Maybe even a week or 2 weeks of me maybe monitoring that, just because if you're checking your hour by hour segment under your reports in campaign view, so pick a campaign, click a campaign, or you could do all your campaigns, go to reports, and then you could see by hour segment. You can see the clicks by hour. If you see early on the day that the clicks or your budget is being spent for a campaign, or you see the conversions come really early in the day, but not later on, there might be a pacing issue there. And what you have to do is just really monitor. From what I would go through is maybe a week or 2 weeks of consistent data to see if there is that cap, if you are getting paced, if there's an issue with the pacing and you are getting basically throttled because your budget is spending early in the morning, and not at night. But I haven't seen this in too many accounts. I see this usually more for like a lead gen account, just because there's more holistic approaches for e-commerce, in my opinion, and it's not just clicking early. Maybe it's just e-commerce in general. A lot of the times, not all the time, but you're going to see purchases when people are off of work or out of work, later on the day. But check and see if you have a pacing issue, and that could be another indicator for you to increase your budget. I know this was a shorter episode, but I think is just really important. I know we've talked about auto apply recommendations before, which is another sneaky thing that Google Ads does. And we've also talked about, locations recommended versus presence. That's another sneaky thing. And this is another sneaky thing with limited by budget. I think is important for us to kind of not be scared of it and not be forced to move prematurely off the lack of analysis. Us just taking a red notification and just clicking it and increasing budget is probably the worst thing that you could do for an account, especially if it's performing. If it's not performing, you're not going to have limited by budget usually. Well, sometimes you will if you're priced out with a max. Maybe your max CPC bids are just too low. In an industry that requires a little bit more of a competitive bid, you could see a limited by budget there. But for the most part, I see limited by budget on accounts that are actually converting. They're actually getting good performance metrics. And that's the worst thing to do, is just immediately click the limited by budget and increase by whatever Google Ads is telling us to increase by. I think that's, a little bit of a blind spot for some PPC managers, especially if you're new. It's super important to do your own due diligence, and hopefully you can understand a little bit more about, why this triggers and when to ignore the notification, and also when to increase and scale. But yeah, if y'all have any questions, email us at theppccave@gmail.com. You could find me at genevillanos.com for any management or consultation. Again, we release every Monday at 12 a.m. Mountain Time, Spotify video, regular Spotify, of course, and YouTube video. And if you have any questions, you could comment on this video or just send us an email. And if there's nothing else, bye for now.